much for joining us this afternoon on this event that Medical Industry Leadership Institute at the Carlson School has collaborated with Prime Therapeutics to bring you the landscape, the changing landscape in the market for biosimilars. And we have a really interesting panel here featuring thought leadership from Prime Therapeutics. And I will shortly introduce our panelists, and then I will ask them to tell us a little bit about the biosimilar market, and then we will actually start a moderated discussion. So a little bit of house rules. If you have questions, please put them in the chat or Q&A, and we will monitor the chat and the Q&A, and then I'll try to sort of blend them in our conversation as much as we can, but we will also have a little bit of time at the very end so we can address some of the questions you may have. Just a little bit of an introduction. My name is Pınar Karacamandic. I am a professor in the finance department at the Carlson School of Management. I'm a health economist, and I'm also the academic director of our Medical Industry Leadership Institute. My personal passion about the biosimilars that you will all hear about is actually, I have a research agenda that started in 2017, looking at the uptake of biosimilar drugs in the US markets. We have several papers looking at the very first biosimilar that was launched in the market, an oncology support drug in 2015. And we have several papers in which we looked at their uptake, their impact on cost and affordability, and how the uptake differs in the different sites, and as well as provider level factors. So really interesting topic, and I'm really excited for this panel. So introducing our panelists, we have Dr. Joseph Leach, who's the Senior Vice President and Chief Medical Officer at Prime Therapeutics. Dr. Leach is responsible for providing clinical leadership and expertise to the enterprise, informing and influencing internal and external stakeholders about Prime's specialty and total drug management capabilities, and contributing to innovation and driving client growth. Dr. Leach joined Prime with more than 20 years of experience as a clinician, researcher, and healthcare leader. And in addition to his role at Prime, he is also a practicing hematologist and medical oncologist with Minnesota Oncology. Dr. Leach earned a bachelor's degree in biology from St. Olaf College and his doctor of medicine degree from the University of Minnesota. Welcome, Dr. Leach. Our second panelist is Kelly McGrail-Pokuta. Dr. McGrail-Pokuta is the Vice President and of the Pharmaceutical Trade Relations at Prime Therapeutics. Dr. Pokuta is responsible for pharmacy and medical rebates, manufacturer contracting, value-based care initiatives, and trade client strategy services. Dr. Pokuta also served as principal owner of Specialty Strategy Solutions, a healthcare consulting company that was established in 2017 for pharmaceutical manufacturers, specialty pharmacy providers, payers, PBMs, and other life sciences organizations. And she has more than 25 years of healthcare experience and brings a wealth of industry knowledge, including expertise in managed care, new product development, brand strategy and marketing, as well as physician practice management, drug intelligence, and pipeline management, payer access, and manufacturer contracting. Dr. Pokuta earned her Doctor of Pharmacy at the University of Illinois College of Pharmacy and completed her postgraduate pharmacy and pharmacy practice residency at the University of Illinois Hospital and Clinics. And third, we have Dr. Brett Sally, PharmD, who's the Assistant Vice President of MedDrive Medical RX Solutions. Dr. Sally is responsible for leading MedDrive Medical RX Solutions, a medical drug management program that you will hear about during this conversation, which provides solutions to help its Blue Plan clients manage the high costs associated with medically billed drugs. Dr. Sally drives drug savings through greater biosimilar drug adoption, creation of benefit designs that prefer lowest net cost non-biosimilar drugs, enhancements in predictive data analytics, and offering medical sourcing opportunities and consultation services. Dr. Sally joined Prime in 2017 and has spent his career in various areas of managed care, identifying ways to improve pharmacy care outcomes and develop drug cost saving strategies. He earned a Doctor of Pharmacy from the University of Minnesota, and a Bachelor of Science in Biochemistry and Molecular Biology and Bachelor of Arts in Chemistry from Bethel University. So I would like to welcome our panelists. And to the audience, I would like to communicate that as the presenter group, we have made a decision to go with our first names. So we're going with Joe, Kelly, and Brett. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us. Okay, so as I said, I'm really passionate about this topic as a researcher in looking at claims data in uptake and costs and how the biosimilars are making in the US markets. But a lot of our audience may not necessarily know much about the biosimilar landscape. So I was wondering if you could please give us sort of like a biosimilars 101 lecture where you could define the biosimilars, give us a little bit of the background on drug pricing and the competitive market and some of the trends and challenges that you see. And I think, I think is it Joe and Kelly, is that, I think you will share a screen. Perfect, thank you.
Thanks, Pinar. Hi, everyone, nice to be with you. Joe Leach here. I think I'm gonna lead us off here. So if we could jump to the next slide, just let's talk about what are biosimilars. These are a very important drug class that has had a pretty profound impact on the way that we treat really important and complex diseases like oncology. But I think it's important to understand how they're different from other drugs. At the end of the day, a biosimilar is a drug, but very different than I think our typical concepts of what drugs are. So if you think about the drugs that we're familiar with, things like aspirin, Tylenol, Lipitor, Prozac, these are chemical compounds that are basically made in a lab. So they're completely synthetic compounds unless they're derived from natural products. But we base the categorization in part just on how big the molecules are. And so not that developing a pharmaceutical drug is easy, but the molecular structure is actually generally pretty simple based on the size and complexity of the molecule. Biologics we can think of as much more complex, really based just on the size of the molecule. So these are very large molecules and frankly, really getting bigger and bigger all the time. And so size alone and complexity is one way to think of differences between biologics versus traditional pharmaceuticals. In fact, so complex that you couldn't synthesize these in a lab. And so, so that's one way to differentiate biologics. But I really think the better way to think of them is how they're produced. So if we can go to the next slide. So biologics aren't just made in a lab. They are actually produced by living organisms. And so if we think about the most common classes of biologics, the one I think most of us are familiar with are monoclonal antibodies. They're the ones that have been around the longest. In my field of oncology, these have really been the most important. Some of our breakthrough medications, things like rituximab, Herceptin, drugs that really change our ability to treat some serious diseases, they're basically designer antibodies, and they are produced by living cells, originally literally made by mice. And so mice were genetically engineered to produce these antibodies, and now they're generally made in cell cultures. But these aren't made just in a production facility. They're produced by living cells. And so I think that's really the best way to think about what's different between biologics and regular drugs. And it's gotten so complex that some of our newer biologics, things like CAR T therapy, for example, aren't just made by living cells, but actually are living cells. And so we're seeing evolution of the complexity of these biologics from cell products to actually completely functioning and living cells. And so when we think about definitions of biosimilarity, I think we're all familiar with the concept of generics, right? So generics are basically identical chemical compounds to the originator drug. So again, take Lipitor, for example. A generic can be synthesized that basically is the exact same structure as the original molecule. Because of the way biologics are developed, again, they're products of living cells, it's not so easy to just replicate that. And so our definition of biosimilarity as defined by the FDA looks at many different factors to determine whether that medicine, this biologic medicine, really is functionally identical to the originator. And so if you look at the FDA's definition of what's required to achieve a label and approval for biosimilarity, they look at what is referred to as the totality of evidence. So it's not just one thing. So we have to look at how is this product function in terms of biologic endpoints, because these are not only produced by living organisms, but they interact with our systems, typically by binding to cells and impacting their function. And so it has to perform the same as the original biologic drug. The assays in terms of how long it stays in the body, whether there are immune reactions to it, all of this data has to prove that there's really no meaningful difference. So again, we can't really prove that the structure is exactly the same, but it has to basically do exactly the same thing that the original drug did. And so I think that that complex definition of biosimilarity compared to, I think, easier to understand definition of a generic drug has led to a little bit of confusion about really what does it mean to be a biosimilar. Now, from a financial standpoint, although biosimilars are newer drugs, this is where they are very similar to generics. And so biosimilars, because they don't require the types of clinical trials required to get the original drug approved, are less expensive. And so when we think about medical economics, and we'll talk more about this, biosimilars give us an opportunity, frankly, that we've needed in this area of very expensive drugs to find some ways to lower the cost. And so biosimilars, as we'll see, are really important because they're clinically as effective, but financially less toxic. So let's go to the next slide. Now, FDA approval around biosimilarity has been a bit complex because there are a couple of different definitions. And so biosimilarity, again, that term can be applied to a new product, but the indications for which that biosimilar is approved can be different than the originator. So for example, a drug that we commonly use in oncology is called Avastin or bevacizumab, and we use it to treat lots of different cancers, colon cancer, lung cancer. But there are some cancers for which the biosimilars haven't got the same approval. So there's a biosimilar to Avastin called MVASI, and while it has many of the same indications, it's not approved for ovarian cancer, which is another type of cancer that we use Avastin routinely. And so one question is, do we feel that clinically these can be interchanged? So even though MVASI doesn't have the indication for ovarian cancer, we think functionally and clinically it is the same thing. Can it safely be used in that indication? And our position at Prime Therapeutics is that it can. And so we really view these as essentially generics. And we do think that the biosimilarity can be extrapolated to other indications. And that's really how we view these drugs. In my practice, we've really been using biosimilars essentially exclusively whenever possible up to about the last year. And we have adopted this position. And so, for example, if we're going to treat a patient with ovarian cancer, we feel comfortable clinically that we're not putting the patient at risk of worse outcomes by using a biosimilar for that specific indication. Now we'll talk a little bit about interchangeability, and that is where drugs are not only approved across indications, but are so similar that actually a pharmacist can substitute that drug without specific authorization by the clinician. And we have our first interchangeable biosimilar that was approved by the FDA recently in a type of insulin. And we'll talk a little bit more about what kinds of implications that classification can have as we look at adoption of biosimilars. So that's, again, sort of what biosimilars and biologics are. So I'm going to turn it over to Kelly just to talk about the landscape in the US.
Kelly, we are not able to hear you.
Oh,
Yeah.
I was on mute. I'm so
Thank
sorry.
you.
I do that all the time. Thanks. So again, when we think about biosimilars, in terms of where they've been globally, they've been available globally outside of the U.S. for a relatively long period of time. Europe has really adopted these programs and products because they feel that there's again, to Joe's point, there's some, even though not directly maybe interchangeable, it's very similar, has the same approach. When we think about the US market, we've had a little bit more of a delay in getting up to speed with biosimilars and aggressively adopting these until pretty much the last couple of years for the most part. When you think about with Europe and the US, some of the differences in the US include things like patent litigation and approval delays of the biosimilar. This is obviously a typical tactic that pharmaceutical manufacturers use to obviously get more additional value out of their product, especially when it's late in its life cycle and it's ready to be expired from a patent perspective. Also in Europe, which is obviously very different from the US, there's a single payer system. It's a lot easier to implement and adopt alternative therapies like biosimilars when there's only one payer involved. In the US, there's thousands and thousands of payers that are involved, and every payer has their own philosophy, their own opportunities that they want to look at, as well as their own financials associated with it. And we talked a little bit about the biosimilar interchangeability, and Joe did a great job in kind of understanding what that means. And typically before pretty much this past month or so, we really didn't have in the US any interchangeable biosimilars. And a lot of that goes into how the FDA has been approving biosimilars historically. Now we do have an interchangeable biosimilar, and as Joe mentioned, it's for a product called Semglee, or insulin glargine. It's a competitor to the product Lantus in the market, if you know of the insulin market. So this is actually a very big deal right now for the US, because this allows us to have the patient go to the pharmacy, get their insulin prescription filled, and if they were getting Lantus, the pharmacist could actually substitute in most states for that particular product without having to call the physician. So that takes a piece of the barrier and friction away from the biosimilar piece, that the pharmacist can actually have a positive impact in helping to improve conversion and adoption. The other piece to this that I think is always an interesting fact is that in Europe, when you think about how they've adopted biosimilars, they've had pretty good consensus for the most part amongst their prescriber and patient communities regarding biosimilar adoption. Pretty much the payer drove a lot of that being single payer. But when you think about it, if you don't have providers on board or prescribers on board, you don't have patients on board, it's really difficult. But they've done a really good job. In the US, I would say in the last few years, we've done a very good job in trying to push this. And we are starting to see a lot of more market shift movement toward biosimilars in various areas like oncology, as an example, as Joe mentioned, as well as some other high cost areas where there's more of this leverage of they are the same and we can essentially interchange, even though it may not be FDA approved. And then finally, the real world evidence piece is not centralized. And this is something that, again, as PBMs work on this, including Prime Therapeutics, we're identifying ways to collect real-time data and real world evidence around these products to ensure that they are actually functioning and acting the same that we would expect from the reference brand product, but then also making sure that we understand what the uptake is and if there's any other barriers that are causing biosimilars to maybe not be utilized. So a little bit of a difference between Europe and US, but we are catching up, which is good. And I think the US has definitely seen a pretty nice increase in the last few years. The other piece to this, when you think about the US market, is that biosimilars are pretty much adjudicated under the medical benefit versus the pharmacy benefit. A lot of these products are physician administered or administered in the doctor's office or the hospital setting, in an outpatient setting as an example. And a lot of these products, as I mentioned, include oncology. There are some products that you can actually administer in the home care setting if someone is getting treatment at home. But for certain therapies, like in oncology, typically those are going to be in the physician's office or the hospital clinic. One of the things with the pharmacy benefit side, it's a little bit of an interesting dynamic. We have some products that were launched several years back in the biosimilar space under the pharmacy benefit, but these products sometimes fluctuate between coverage on the pharmacy or the medical benefit with our plans. So it's not a universal impact to say that if it's under the pharmacy benefit, you can go ahead and try to implement the biosimilar. It really depends upon how the coverage looks like and which part of the benefit is paying for that service. A couple of things to remember too with this is that the market share movement in biosimilars, there's various barriers. As I mentioned prior to this, the payer, prescriber, and patient idea around what they think biosimilars are and where do they fit in therapy. And sometimes it's a little bit of concern on the part of the prescriber, as an example, where they may feel it may not be exactly the same. So if someone's been stable on a reference brand product, is switching them going to be okay? Patients may also have a perception that, again, it's biosimilar, it's cheaper, but maybe it's not going to be as effective. So those are the types of issues, and I kind of call them the biosimilar myths that we see, that we really need to help educate and coach through the work that Prime Therapeutics does, as well as others, as well as our plans that we serve, because there's a lot of communication and clarification. And then finally, the biosimilar pricing on the medical benefit is different than pharmacy. And what this essentially means is when you get a discount on a medical or pharmacy product, it's essentially called a rebate. It's a percentage off of the price of the product, either on the pharmacy side of the benefit or the medical side. Typically on the pharmacy benefit, this is based off of wholesale acquisition cost. And that really is kind of the way that pharmacies purchase the product from a wholesaler, as an example, or what other supplier they obtain medications from. On the medical side, it's kind of a mixture of things. It can be off of what we call average sales price, which is an average price that's paid by different payers, et cetera, and there's certain discounts attached to it. And you can also have wholesale acquisition costs. So there's a lot more inconsistency. It's not an all or none, but you'll see a different payment mechanism on the medical side, which causes complexity, because when you think about a rebate or a discount on WAC, that could look very different than a discount on average sales price. So this is sort of what we're contending with right now and some of the issues we're dealing with. If we can go to the next slide, please. So here's what we're doing to gain momentum. I think there's really been some great movement, and I'm really excited because as Prime Therapeutics, from a positioning standpoint, we are definitely a leader in the biosimilar space, and we are very much an advocate in promoting biosimilars to obviously manage to the lowest net cost for our clients as well as for our members. But when you think about it in terms of the approach that we have here, so there's really a four-pronged approach to identify what we need to do here. First and foremost is that this brand biologic drug growth, it basically helps to increase the support that we need to say biosimilars are a great substitute for these products, because it's a much better way to manage costs, and costs are key. But also what's interesting is we're preserving the clinical effectiveness of the products. So we're not providing inferior products. We're not providing things that have more side effects or other challenges with it. It's essentially a very same or similar product in terms of what you should expect. So if it's something that's an injectable, for example, and the patient's giving themselves a shot, if you see some injection site reaction where they get irritation in their skin when they inject themselves with a needle because of the product, we would probably expect that the biosimilar would have the same effect. So there really isn't any difference there. We talked a little bit about the payer payment structures, and as you can imagine, in the U.S. market, the payer payment structure is completely complicated. And that's really, I think, been a very interesting part of the world that we live in. And we're going to start to see more of our government payment system adopting more of these biosimilars as we go forward. So more to come on that, and definitely there's definitely opportunities to improve upon that. What's interesting is that there's various healthcare organizations that are also, as well as the U.S. government, that are also positioning biosimilars as the way to go. And that's really what you want to provide to help reduce healthcare costs, obviously manage the patient's expense. And essentially what, if patients have to have an out-of-pocket expense, if you can give them a cheaper product like a biosimilar that's clinically as effective, why wouldn't we want to do that? The patient has to pay less out of pocket. The U.S. government just this year released some guidelines around biosimilar education for patients and prescribers. And I think it's a step in the right direction, and it's gaining some momentum. There's also different organizations like the American Medical Association, which obviously a big advocate of this, as well as the American College of Pharmacy, American Academy of Managed Care Pharmacy, that is out there really helping to pave the way and set some of the stage here. And then finally, when you think about the management strategies, so when you think about biosimilars, and we talked about pharmacy and medical benefit differences in terms of pricing, one of the things that you have to think about is sometimes there's a blend between pharmacy and medical, and how the utilization is managed across these benefits. One of the things that will be interesting to kind of pull through, and that's where Prime comes into play, is to understand how we can understand what's on the pharmacy benefit, understand what's on the medical benefit from a coverage standpoint, but holistically manage the patient. And what I mean by that is that it's a great opportunity for us to go in and say, okay, we're going to have the same criteria to get this drug or not to get this drug on the pharmacy benefit, if that's where it's covered, or the medical benefit. There's also opportunity to take a look at products on the medical benefit that potentially can shift to the pharmacy benefit because it potentially could be more cost effective, again, depending upon therapy class. So there's a lot of different opportunities here, that levers that we can pull to make sure that we're gaining more momentum and getting more adoption. And these things have kind of evolved, and I really feel like we're at a crossroads right now that we're starting to see much more adoption and much more acceptance of biosimilars as we go forward. With that, I'll turn it over to Brett.
Yeah, thanks, Kelly. So just disclaimer, there's a few slides in here. There's some really good charts in an IQVIA report. They do kind of feature landscapes on different attributes of the healthcare system, focus a lot on drugs, and they did a 2020 report dedicated to biosimilars, which I think we could have developed some of our own internal data on this, but this is public information that just really highlights a lot of the different attributes that are going on right now in the biosimilar landscape. And Pinar is probably pretty familiar with this herself, probably contributed to some of it. I don't know. She'll probably make some comments on it, but why is this important? I think this chart shows two things really quickly. One is that biologics are trending as a contributor to drug spend at the highest rate of kind of all the drug classes if you just combine them together, biologics and small molecules. So just kind of really bifurcating that, biologics trending at around 14 to 15% over the past several years versus small molecules, what Joe had referenced, your aspirins or just your drugs that come in pills and tablets and are come in a 30-day supply. Those are not contributing very significantly to increase in spend. It's really all in the biologic space. And then number two, why this is important, biologics make up a ton of the total US drug spend right now. In the 2019 metric, it was like around 43%. And so just maybe running that out a couple of years at the, that 15% CAGR, it's probably around 50% or more now. And top categories, oncology, a little over half, diabetes, insulin, biologic molecules, probably 2/3 of that whole class. And we have this giant class of immunology, which is a little bit of a catch-all, but includes really big drugs like Remicade, Stelara, Humira, Enbrel, all these MABs, these monoclonal antibodies that have been a staple of immunotherapy for autoimmune conditions like rheumatoid arthritis, Crohn's disease, ulcerative colitis, psoriasis. There are an absolute ton of drugs and new drugs that keep coming out with new mechanisms of actions. It all kind of started with Remicade, Enbrel, Humira back in like 1998, 2002, 2003, when those three drugs came out. Tumor necrosis factor inhibitors was a staple of therapy. And then that just sort of evolved into different mechanisms of action that they came out with IL-17s, having IL-23 blockers in the psoriasis space. Lots of competition continues, lots of new brands continue to come out. But the fascinating thing is, I'll say this ahead of the time, but I just referenced three drugs, Remicade, Enbrel, and Humira, approved in 1998, 2002, 2003. Remicade finally has biosimilar competition, but it did last a good 18 years without it. And the other two drugs still have yet to have biosimilar competition. And so there's another kind of fascinating thing that these are very complex molecules. The regulatory landscape took a really long time to mature, but now we have a better formed pathway for it. So again, 2 points, like why is this important? Biologics are driving all the trend, and they make up a ton of cost in the space. Next slide here. So a little bit of an outlook on where can we expect competition and biosimilar competition. Follow the dancing arrows there. So of this market, this biologic market, that's about around $200 billion-ish. we can expect biosimilar competition in the vast majority of it. So at the time of this slide, it's probably still about relevant. 20% of that biologic market is facing biosimilar competition right now, with another really big chunk, this other 64% that has the potential for biosimilar competition. And there's a ton of activity in the pipeline. And so it kind of next arrow, 50%, $67 billion does not have current competition, but does have molecules that are in development there. So there's this other chunk around the 17% kind of lower left corner there, non-recombinant vaccines. We're not expecting biosimilar competition on those types of vaccine molecules, but just a little bit of a flyover. The vast majority of the biologic market, we can expect biosimilar competition at some point. Go on to the next one here. I really loved this slide because just building on what Joe and Kelly had laid out as a foundation of, well, we do have biosimilars on the market now. They've been around for a few years and they are starting to gain some uptake. But there's an interesting story that starts to play out when you peel apart a little bit of this chart. So Joe mentioned Avastin or bevacizumab. That's the light blue, kind of that top line and the top bar on this graph. Within about a year after being on the market, in aggregate, there was about 42% biosimilar market share. Fast, like obviously, this chart shows it was the fastest uptake of any molecule that we had seen to date. And it's in the oncology space, which to me was a little bit surprising as well. After that, trastuzumab, rituximab, filgrastim, oncology and oncology supportive medications, all seeing moderate but solid uptake of the biosimilars there. And we have this one, infliximab, that's the Remicade, the generic name for Remicade, infliximab. It's just really this kind of really grumpy, slow line on the very bottom there. And after 24 months, it attained about a 6% market share, the biosimilars did. And even today, so that started in 2016, or we'll just call it 2017. So nearly 4 years on the market. I think that national market share number is probably still in the very low double digits, probably 10%, maybe a little bit above there. I think maybe I've seen 15%. But that just really plays into like, well, why is this different? Why is cancer, where there's like more life and death situations than your rheumatoid arthritis, why are they gaining more market share? And I think it really is a mix of clinical comfort, but a really big part about financial dynamics that play into it as well. That I don't know if we can fully pull apart in the next 20 minutes, but there's a really interesting financial story that plays out, and maybe just a really light touch on that. Or if you move over to the right side of the slide there. So where is uptake of bevacizumab happening within a year of launch? And at the very top of the chart, you see this non-340B clinics, and we're getting a little bit technical saying 340B or non-340B. I guess the layman's term of that is, are you eligible for government mandated buy purchase discounts on drug? And the clinics that have those government mandated purchase discounts on drug have much lower uptake of bevacizumab biosimilar than the non-clinics do. So again, not fully pulling all this apart, but there's some like back-end financial dynamics that obviously are at play, including what Kelly alluded to, which is kind of the rebate dynamics on the payer side. So there's a whole bunch of different players in the channel: the manufacturer, the wholesaler, the distributor, the provider, and the payers, that all need to really get everything right in order to enable, more and better uptake of the biosimilar products. So lastly, where are we at today within the biosimilar landscape, and where are we looking in the pipeline? What's the next big event? So by the numbers on the left side, we now have 11 innovator or reference products that have biosimilars that have been approved. Some of those are listed over on the right side there, but only 8 of those products are currently available on the market. You can get approved before you have the legal ability to market your product and sell it due to how the patents and exclusivities play out. So only 8 of those products are actually active on the market. You can go to your doctor and, if you're eligible for it, get a prescription for a biosimilar today. 8 of those products have a biosimilar competition today. In total, there's about 31 biosimilars that have been approved. Even one, I think, is last week or the week before got approved. And I'll talk about that in a second. But only one of all these approvals have this interchangeable designation. And that was for, I should have listed it on here, that was for that a competitor to the Lantus product, which is the second drug listed over in the chart there. And that's very important because it just enables a lot easier uptake where you don't have to get a new prescription and you don't have to get a prescription, you don't have to have ask the clinician or the prescriber to switch the product. You can actually just do it at the pharmacy itself. And so I think that will certainly enable a lot more uptake of that product as itself. So what's happening for the outlook of the biosimilar pipeline? I will note at let's start at the very bottom of the chart, Lucentis. I just picked, there's a whole list of these drugs. I just picked the top 20 just because I thought it fit onto a chart easier and you don't really care about some of the smaller drugs anyway. But Lucentis is a drug for macular degeneration, macular diabetic edema, eye conditions. So just last week, I think it was last week, it got a biosimilar approved. It's going to be available on the market in mid-2022. That's the next event, I think, is the next meaningful event in the biosimilar landscape that's going to happen. Even though it's number 20 in our top 20 biologics chart here, it has a really meaningful impact in the Medicare space because these VEGF or these kind of macular degeneration type of products are one of the top classes in Medicare. So it's going to be a lot bigger, make a lot bigger splash there than is the commercial or Medicaid markets. But back up to the top of the chart, one of the biggest events that's probably going to happen in the next several years is that Humira is going to have biosimilar competition at the very beginning, I think the beginning of 2023. So you can see just by, it's about a $20 billion drug in the US annually. So head and shoulders above all these other biologics. That's going to be the single biggest event that's going to happen. It's going to be on the pharmacy side. There's a number of competitors that already have approvals. They're already getting queued up to launch, and Prime's already starting to have conversations with those manufacturers and start to lay out a strategy there. And again, Humira, originally approved 2002, has enjoyed or will enjoy about 21 years of exclusivity on the market, and compare that to a small molecule drug, which by the time they get to market usually has like 7 to 10 years of exclusivity before they face generic competition. It's just a really different landscape with these biologics. After that, you see Stelara on there. Might be a 2023 loss of exclusivity with some competition the following year. Victoza in the diabetes space might have some competition in 2024. Is loss of exclusivity. There's a few drugs like Xolair near the bottom of the list there. It's already lost its exclusivity, but there just hasn't been a biologic that's gone through the development and got approval yet. So it's a little bit of a mixed bag, and a lot of it has to do with the complication with producing a very large molecule, a protein molecule that is complicated, and you need to produce some complicated trials to get it through the approval process. So with that, I think I'll kind of stop about this, the 101, the landscape, and turn it back over to Pinar.
Thank you so much. Wow, what an amazing amount of information. Thank you. I mean, so very interesting. I was just, I kept nodding as you were showing the slides. I mean, in our work here at the University of Minnesota, we have a collaboration with the Mayo Clinic as well. And some of the work that we did is 2 of the biosimilars that are launched, filgrastim and infliximab. We were able to, look at some of the trends that you were sharing, Brett, on both the Medicare Advantage and the Medicare fee-for-service populations, and as well as the commercially insured. And but it's, I mean, such a big part of the increasing drug costs, but I think also super eye-opening, the amount of competition coming in the coming years, and really interesting market. But so you guys covered a lot of information. I think let's kind of dive in and maybe pick them in a little bit more, and maybe as these new biosimilars are coming in, and you alluded to some of them coming in at this pharmacy benefit side, you know, as well as the medical benefit side. Currently, they're mainly in the medical benefit side. How are payers managing the benefit design and making formulary decisions or medical policy decisions? And you know, with this new competition coming in, and how are the payment models evolving, or are they evolving?
I mean,
I can start off with that. Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead.
Brett.
Sorry.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I would just say from a payment model perspective, you know, there's definitely a lot of different levers and tactics we can employ. So some of the things are, you know, looking at shifting things from one benefit design to another to reduce costs potentially. That doesn't always work in all situations, and then you have to think about the patient disruption and friction, as well as the provider friction with that too. But then there's other ways that we can look at pretty unique ways of thinking about how do we maybe help increase provider acceptance, for example, through a value-based agreement that a health plan could actually implement. And that would be an opportunity to say, if you choose a biosimilar, maybe your reimbursement is better at the provider level versus if you had the reference brand product. So there's a lot of different modalities you can use in this case. So Brett, if you want to expand, feel free.
Yeah, I mean, two other aspects on that, kind of patient and provider. The traditional benefit structures have sort of proven not to be quite adequate in these high cost specialty drugs. I mean, this, my opinion. I mean, there's probably a few reasons for that, but it's like, let's just take an average claim of infliximab. Let's say it's like $4,000. $4,000 for a claim. So an average person is going to completely consume their full out-of-pocket responsibility, the maximum out-of-pocket, pretty quickly and early in the year. And so putting it on a preferred tier status doesn't really have a whole lot of teeth or incentive to the member, in my opinion. We do have some clients that have embraced of like, well, let's just kind of philosophically create a bifurcated tier, even within the medical side, of preferred drugs and underneath the specialty, and make sure that the member out-of-pocket cost share is a little bit lower for those biosimilars, even though we're talking the difference between a $5,000 drug and the innovator and a $4,000 drug and the biosimilar. Let's just kind of philosophically try to do the right thing and make sure that the member is in no way paying more and is trying to pay less, even though that they're probably going to consume all their out-of-pocket amount by the end of the year. Mm-hmm. That's kind of one thing. And secondly, on the provider side, we do have some clients that are testing out some different payment procedures where they are looking at trying to give a little bit more reimbursement as kind of a percent of charges go to the biosimilar drugs to, one, make sure that they're even on the payments that they receive, or potentially secondly, able to make a little bit more money on the biosimilars, knowing that the payer's pocket's going to get squeezed a little bit if they give more money on the biosimilar, kind of eating away a little bit at that, but in the long run might play out to be a beneficial strategy to encourage adoption of a preferred product.
Yeah, so thank you. And Joe, maybe if you can say a little bit more about sort of provider perceptions. I mean, the pricing is really, really complicated. And if you have more time, I would love to talk more about some of the challenges in the pricing side. But in addition to pricing, it's also, there is this, how the stakeholders respond to price, and that includes patients and providers. Joe, I don't know if you could maybe comment a little bit about how do providers and patients respond to price, and some of the maybe provider perceptions and how they may be evolving.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. And I think it varies depending on your clinical setting. Brett's comment, that's kind of surprising that oncology has been leading the way for biosimilar adoption when you would think they would be last, just given the state of the diseases we treat. When biosimilars were first being approved, there was a lot of resistance. I don't think docs were paying attention to what a biosimilar even was. If you think about what doctors are interested in, I mean, we're usually looking for the new, sexy, more effective drug, right? And so the data we pay attention to are the approvals where we have a better treatment option than we used to have, and that's not what biosimilars are. We don't have the kind of randomized data that we're used to show efficacy. And this definition of biosimilarity, I think, is kind of complicated. So it took a lot of education, I think, to get doctors to the point of, number one, paying attention, and then number two, being comfortable adopting this. You know, from my own experience, I'll tell you that we have pretty much bought in, at least in the oncology space, and I think that's true of most oncologists. I think one of the reasons oncologists have been quicker to adapt is our patients tend not to be on drugs for a long time. And if you think about someone with rheumatoid arthritis, I mean, they're going to be on maintenance therapy oftentimes for many years, and getting someone who is comfortable with taking a drug that's controlling their disease and then switching to something with a different name, I think that's really difficult. From our perspective, our patients, you know, again, just because of the nature of what we do, tend not to be on them for a long time. And so it hasn't really been as challenging for adoption. I think if we were switching a lot of patients, for example, from Herceptin to a biosimilar, that would be a little bit more difficult. But honestly, it really comes down to the patient-doctor communication. If I don't express reservation to my patient about substituting Mvasi for Avastin, honestly, my patients are very comfortable with it. If I say, well, your Blue Cross Blue Shield is telling me I have to switch, you know, to this drug, then that's going to raise a lot of red flags. And so I think that's one from a purely clinical perspective. The other is always about the money, right? I mean, unfortunately, economics play a big role, and it plays a big role in provider practices as well. So I think to Brett's point, it's important that we not make this a money-losing situation for providers. If practices are going to benefit financially from using originator drugs, you know, the people who run their practices are going to encourage them to use those originator drugs. And so if you look at, you know, the 340B data, the reality is a lot of the choice that doctors get, it's based on what is chosen by the formularies if they're hospital-based. And so a lot of times docs don't really have the choice, especially if they're practicing in a large setting. And so it's important that we don't cause incentives that encourage institutions to use the more expensive drugs because they're going to benefit from it.
Yeah, thank you. By the way, the data that you showed with bevacizumab and the 340B, we have the similar trend, lower uptake in 340B for filgrastim products as well in the data that we're looking at. So what are some initiatives and programs that can help the uptake of biosimilars that providers can play a role in? And does Prime have certain programs that are exactly targeting that provider uptake?
I mean, well, Prime has an initiative labeled MedDrive, where we do have a pretty comprehensive program around consulting to our health plans and providing provider support as well around, you know, biosimilar initiatives. It's not all about biosimilar initiatives, but for the purpose of today's conversation, a big portion of it really is around, you know, biosimilars, because in the past couple of years, we now have competition for what have historically been some of the top, probably 5 of the top 10 medical drugs that really didn't change for about 10 years. We're talking about Remicade, Herceptin, Avastin, Rituxan, and Neulasta. And a really big chunk of that is in the oncology space now, like what Joe referred to. So we have put together a platform for one, what Kelly said, driving low unit cost. One of the unit cost inputs is around reimbursement to providers and around kind of the net cost to the health plan. So what we can acquire and what we can negotiate from a rebate perspective. So we have really comprehensive modeling that goes out to plans around what we have developed for kind of all those cost inputs. And we look at their current market share. We forecast out how we think conversion is going to go, even looking at major providers within the health plan's landscape. A major oncology provider, for example, if there's a good relationship and a health plan can communicate early about an upcoming change, that's one of the things that we highly encourage. And so we identify kind of big network impacts as well as kind of the whole landscape, including our prime statement on biosimilars and how we believe that they are interchangeable, just from or extractable from a clinical perspective. So we provide that. We provide insights in what's going on in the national landscape, the marketing, and kind of the reporting uptake. So once we have launched an initiative, we come back to it in 6 months to check in on how it's going. And in particular, if there are areas that are not going well, meaning if an area isn't experiencing the expected uptake, we try to identify who those players are, and maybe it's an institution. And one of the things I was going to chime in when Joe was talking around, whether it's a 340B or just a non-340B provider, we see the choice of product, in particular with biosimilars, it's a provider by provider initiative. There's a very large provider down in Texas who we were tracking at the very beginning or the end of 2020 as having literally no uptake in bevacizumab biosimilar. But we did see it start to peak up by the end of Q1 in 2021, and then was nearly like 30 to 40% by the end of Q2 2021. So clearly it was an institution specific change that happened that needs to be kind of collaborative and communicated with the plan, because the institutions don't want to be surprised because they have financial goals that they need to model out, and then they need to make sure that their purchasing is in line and their whole kind of value stream is in line prior to making a change. And so early communication is one of the really big things. Just quickly, medical policy advisory. We have a suite of medical policies that we have vetted, that are manufacturer and contract compliant, that we think are clinically supported with our prime philosophy and through our P&T, as well as tools that we help communicate, can be posted online by the plans as well.
Thank you, Brett. So I wanted to shift gear. I think we have like 7 minutes. I want to make sure I get 2 questions out to our panelists. One of them is a little bit shifting gear, and maybe Kelly, you may be the best position to take this one, is to think about the manufacturers and thinking about how do manufacturers interact with the health plans and the PBMs and others, and what are some of the trends and the barriers that biosimilar manufacturers have faced, and how is it changing?
Sure, that's a great question. So it has definitely changed in the medical space. Historically, a lot of the manufacturers really did not provide any value to the pharmacy benefit management side of the house in terms of medical rebates historically. We at Prime actually have been a leader in this space for the last several years, where we had really good medical rebates. But obviously with the MedDrive program, now it's more formalized and it's a much bigger program, taking the coalition of our Blues plans and leveraging their volume. So there's a lot of benefit for pharma with what we do. I think from pharma's perspective, a couple of things happen. They do have those individual, local, regional relationships at those provider groups. And a lot of times they can contract directly with those providers and get what we call buy and bill, where it's essentially the provider buys it and then they bill the insurance for the product. There's no pharmacy typically involved, and generally whatever they bill to the health plan can be somewhat high, and they're going to see how much they can extract from the health plan directly. There's other options out there that pharma is now looking. They recognize the value of a coalition approach with the PBM driving this. And with our particular situation at Prime, we have Blues plans, and Blues plans are a very interesting group for pharma because these patients that stay with Blues plans typically will stay for a longer period of time. There's a lot of great longitudinal use and data and things that are a benefit to pharma to understand how their market is maturing, but then also how their product and competitor products are performing. There's a lot of value there. I think from the pharma side, the other part of it is a lot of these big manufacturers that have been in the industry, the typical AbbVies of the world and the Sanofi and a lot of the big players, they now partner with a lot of these smaller biotech companies in the biosimilar space, either as a true partnership with eventual acquisition or a joint venture or some other arrangement. This allows them to be much more flexible and nimble to get products to market in a much faster way versus going through the traditional channels of big pharma. because a lot of times these products, even though there may not be a large amount of volume attached to it, there's a lot of dollars, but sometimes pharma wants those bigger blockbuster drugs that generate, billions and billions of dollars and have a huge audience, like in the diabetes space as an example. So this gives an opportunity for pharma to really think about what their strategy is in terms of product development, and most importantly, how they're going to manage the life cycle of that product in the environment. And that's really where they've started to look very closely at PBMs like Prime Therapeutics in the last several years, because there is that value. And because we have this captive audience and we can drive, ideally, alignment to different therapies and strategies on the medical side, which is not done very easily across, for example, non-Blues health plans. Typically, it could be a little more difficult, perhaps, especially with other PBMs that have a very large, kind of hybrid group of types of plans. Because we have that focus, it allows pharma to feel that we're giving them the attention that they need. The other part of it, I would say, manufacturers are always talking to doctor offices. They're always wanting to engage with our health plans at the local, regional levels. So there's a lot of collaboration that we share amongst our pharma partners. We don't look at pharma as being kind of an enemy to us. We all have a vested interest and a stake in this. And pharma does provide some significant value at that prescriber level, especially if there's information about the product that needs to be shared, or there's questions around reimbursement or other things that might be coming up that they have potentially the opportunity to help advise on. So we look at our relationship with pharma as being very positive, very strong, along with our clients. And it really becomes this multi-pronged approach, because we all have the benefit of seeing what the positive value this product can bring, most importantly, to the patient.
Yeah, thank you, Kelly. I guess last 2 minutes, and I would like to ask maybe Joe to conclude for us, and maybe give us a little bit more insight on, you mentioned and you talked about in the when you were discussing the slide deck, Prime's position in the biosimilar policy and the interchangeables, and how does that policy compare to other payers, and how are these positions changing? And also, if you have any maybe last call to action for this audience of students and health management influencers and professionals.
Yeah, thanks. This is a really important time, because we all know that the cost of healthcare is spiraling in this country, and we always talk about trying to get value. We want people to have access to these really important drugs, and these are really important drugs, but we also have to address the financial toxicity. The cost of healthcare is spiraling, and much of that spiraling cost is this class of drugs. And so the position that we've taken, and we're not alone in this, all of the payers are really trying to improve biosimilar uptake. The federal government is trying to improve, biosimilar uptake. This is a class of drugs that does not harm patients. These drugs really are equally effective to the originators. They don't worsen patient experience. They really are functionally just as good. They're just cheaper. And an opportunity where we can reduce cost without negatively impacting patients is something we really need to latch on to. And so any lost opportunity for increasing uptake and utilization of these is just a lost opportunity for all of us. And so I think that's, if we think about why are these important, that's why. And so hopefully this pipeline will continue to deliver, and we'll be able to continue to deliver this message to people who need these drugs and people who prescribe these drugs. We need to increase utilization.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much to our panelists, and definitely there's just such rich information, and I think we could take another few hours discussing a lot more on all of these components. And I guess on our end, on the research side as well, we have much more room to go. And now with 8 in the market and more coming in, and hopefully the data will catch up, and we'll be able to look at these trends of uptake and how the biosimilars are providing as an affordable alternative to the reference biologics. Thanks to our audience for joining us, and thank you very much. Have a very nice evening.